Hello everybody, welcome back to Law Hero. My name is Jen and I make videos about the law, but more often than not recently I've been doing some book reviews and kind of trying to make sense of the world like everybody else. And now that COVID has kind of receded and has become less of a thing, I've been thinking about it more in a historical nature, in that I want to understand how it began, its context and whatnot. So I've been educating myself a little bit around sociology, and who better to turn to than Malcolm Gladwell and his book The Tipping Point, which I believe he wrote in the year 2000 actually. So I mean, this is what, 20 years before COVID, but obviously there's been countless epidemics in the world. I mean, this is even before Ebola. So yeah, I mean, a tipping point basically means how little things can make a big difference. And I think it's important to have a look at what he says and apply it to our modern day living. So if you haven't already done so, please subscribe. It really gives me some support, and as well as that, you can follow along on Instagram. I don't do specifically law stuff. I mean, law is my bread and butter, but obviously as a lawyer we're interested in all areas of life, be it like philosophy, sociology, psychology, anything that's directly impacts human behaviour. That's what I'm all about. So as I was reading the book, I took notes of what really stood out to me, so it would make the video interesting, otherwise we'd be here all day. It's not necessarily a big book. I think it took me like a week to read, but yeah, it's quite dense in terms of, I guess, abstract notions and applying those abstract notions to real life concepts. So yeah, I mean, it's a great book to read, but here you have basically a summary. So as I said, the premise of the book is that one dramatic moment can change everything, and in an epidemic this is called the tipping point. Gladwell asserts that there are three characteristics to the tipping point. The first is contagiousness. The second is that small or little consequences can have big effects. And the third is that change happens not gradually. So when we speak about contagiousness, and the first thing I thought about, and it's actually an example he gives in the book, is yawning. Yawning is an emotional contagion, and it is a human reaction to other humans. Some people say it's a way of communicating, but all we know for sure is that yawning is contagious. The second principle of epidemics is that little changes can somehow have a big effect. And as humans, we're heavily socialized to make a rough kind of approximation between cause and effect. For example, if you want to communicate a strong emotion, or if you want to convince someone, for example, that you love them, you use passionate and forthright language. Or when you're making or breaking bad news to somebody, you lower your voice and you choose your words carefully. And it is difficult for us to understand that somehow something small can have a large reaction, because usually the way we think in any transaction or relationship or system is that the intensity as regards input relates to the intensity as regards output. So the first agent is the law of a few, and that means that few people can cause the tipping point. As we know, in Wuhan, China, somebody somewhere had a bat in a market, and that in itself doesn't seem to be likely to cause an epidemic. but what's important is that it was caused by one person. The second one is the stickiness factor. Now, what that means, and we'll discuss that in a moment, is that is kind of difficult to apply to COVID because it's to do with, you know, making an example that sticks. Now, I suppose in a biological sense, COVID stuck because, you know, it was a virus. So a virus is quite sticky. So in that regard, you could say that the stickiness factor of COVID was the fact that it was a virus. And then the third one, which is the power of context. When it comes to COVID-19 as an epidemic, you may have seen the TED Talk where it discusses the fact that human beings are encroaching on the natural world environment as regards, so animals, the more we encroach in their environment, the more we hunt them, the more we take their land, that this causes an imbalance between human and other mammals living in harmony together. And in that regard, some people argue that we are going to have more epidemics because the context or the environment is dictating that, because of our encroachment on the natural world, as well as the globalization of this world, which other people said increased how COVID spread. For example, international travel, our reliance on supply chain, our reliance on international pharma, that kind of a thing, our interconnectedness within ourselves as humans, but also on the animal world, means that the context was rife for an epidemic. Just like when there was the plague, the level of the lack of knowledge around healthcare, the lack of knowledge around cleanliness made it so that a few people with a sticky virus was able to spread. And you remember, you know, they closed theatres and all of that, just like they did with COVID, but it's the same principle, it's just a different context. That's all that's changed. When we look at the law of a few, Gladwell, and I found this one particularly interesting because it means that certain people have the power to create a lot of change. We know this because we know leaders are able to evoke certain emotions in us. But he begins the book by talking about the 6 degrees of separation. And you may know this as regards human interconnectedness, that basically you're removed from everyone by about just 6 steps. But he says it's not as simple as that, what basically means is that a very small number of people are linked to everyone else in a few steps, and the rest of us are linked to the world through those special few. And these people are called connectors, and they have a very special gift of bringing people together. They're sprinkled through every walk of life, they're in different industries, and they just have a special way of making friends and acquaintances. You may be able to think of these people off the top of your head. So these are the types of people who collect people, and they don't see it as a business strategy, they see it rather as who they are. These are the type of people who send birthday cards to everybody. They're not your usual social, social behavior. A good example of a connector is Paul Revere. You might remember he got on his horse and alerted everybody in Boston in the 18th century that the British were about to attack. Now, there was another man that night who did the exact same thing, but Gladwell argues Paul Revere and his actions were effective because of his connective nature, in that he was able to go to the right people when he entered a town in Boston on that fateful night. He was a very charismatic man. He was able to spread message quickly, in that he was the quintessential connector. As regards the market, a connector in the market is called a maven, which is actually a Yiddish word, and it means someone who accumulates knowledge. So these are people who know everything about, like, the prices going up and down. If you think about Warren Buffett, he would be an example of a maven. And then the third type of person he looks at is a salesperson and the type of behavior they have. So when it comes to salespeople, it's very subtle things salespeople do which make them charismatic. For example, they nod their head a lot, they smile a lot, they'll say your name. And again, this is around his argument that small things can make a big difference. The second implication of this is that they use a lot of non-verbal cues. Their emotions are written all over their face. They're very straightforward. And how all of this is affected is through something called microrhythms. And what they basically do is they mimic your they mimic your pitch, they mirror your body language. It's almost like they're entering into a dance, and this is how they build rapport, is basically through empathy. And in the book, there is a book called Emotional Contagion, and there's a phrase called a mimic cry, which basically means that in highly emotional people, they basically send their emotions to other people. So for example, if they smile, you'll want to smile as well. And basically what that means is that they're capable of passing on emotions to other people, which is odd because we're all taught to believe that emotions come from the inside out, but actually a lot of the time emotions come from the outside in. And psychologists call these people senders. And basically these senders are people who, you know, you may know them in your everyday life, but they're people who will actually, when they smile, you smile kind of a person. And they're very, very influential people. Now to move on to the stickiness factor. And as regards COVID, I said the stickiness factor in COVID was the fact that it was a virus and viruses spread. But what happens when it's like a non-medical epidemic, like for example, Sesame Street? Sesame Street is an example of the stickiness factor because kids did not want to look away from it. They did extensive research of kids watching episodes of Sesame Street to find out how do we get kids not to look away, essentially. For example, in the world of direct marketing, this is how we, you know, reach consumers. And through their research with Sesame Street, the child educators found that kids don't watch a show when they are stimulated, like lots of different colors and sounds and music and puppets. They don't look at a TV show when they're stimulated and look away when they are bored. What they actually found was that kids look away when they're confused. And for example, if you're watching a YouTube video or you're listening to a YouTube video, you might start tuning out when you might say to yourself, okay, they've lost me. I'm gonna tune out now because I'm kind of lost and kind of confused. Or think of when somebody's talking to you and they're like la 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 la, and you're like, nah, I've lost them. You'll basically tune out when you're confused, just like a child. So they found with Sesame Street, the best thing to do was keep the message simple, not use complicated terms so that the kids would keep watching. And a follow-on to Sesame Street was Blue's Clues. It's an American TV show. When I looked it up, it was actually quite like Bosco, which was my favourite Irish TV show as a child. And it was basically the same thing. It just follows Bosco's life. We get to see what he gets up to, but we're also participated to involve in Bosco's life, where like Bosco would go, what do you think, boys and girls? And we would have to, you know, have an opinion. We would have to shout our answer, which means that we were getting involved. And that's what made Blue's Clues irresistible to kids, was that final hurdle of them being involved in the program. The other massive thing about stickiness is that the information has to be easy to package. So what they found when, as regards like information booklets about, you know, getting a vaccine or whatever was, the more resistance or the more information, the information overload that is there, the less sticky the message will be. So like, for example, Nike, just do it. That's a very sticky message because it's easy to remember. It makes sense in the context of the brand, and it's a simple message with information that we can take away, process, and it makes sense to us. It doesn't confuse us. Finally, the power of context. I already mentioned this in relation to COVID, but the really interesting case study Gladwell gives in his book is that of in the 1980s in New York, when there was a graffiti epidemic, if you will, on the subway carriages. So they found a direct correlation between graffiti and the epidemic of crime. And for them, their strategy was to keep every subway carriage clean, to send a direct message to you know, the vandals that graffiti wasn't going to be tolerated. If you spend your time trying to communicate messaging through graffiti on these carriages, they were going to clamp down on it. They weren't going to see the light of day. And it just goes to show you that when they broke that kind of cycle within the environment, and when there was less graffiti to be seen, it wasn't necessarily cause and effect in that the crime went down when the graffiti went away, but it changed the environment in which the criminals were operating, and it made it less palatable to be a criminal. The other really interesting example of context is around what was it called? Social channel capacity. This is within the power of context. And he gives the example of the company Gore-Tex in the US. They make this kind of like waterproof material if you're going camping or whatever. I've used it myself. And what they found is that when you have 150 people or less in an organization, when you have less than 150 people in an organization, this is like the tipping point almost for strong social relationships, and that basically anything above that, we're not able to conceive the relationships above that. So let me explain. So obviously the more relationships you have, the more dynamics you have to keep track of. But the problem for organizations that if you have too large an organization, people lose things in common, and then people start to become strangers with each other. And the reason this is important is because when you have two people, what you create is a transactive memory. And what that means is you don't remember everything. Sometimes you rely on other people for memory and they of you. And what this means is that you have a collective, almost collective consciousness with other people, but it only works up until a point, because after that you can't really process those relationships and memories with too many people, because we suffer information overload. We're not able to do that. So for example, you might say to someone, would you remind me about that time we did that, because your memory is kind of hazy and you're relying on their memory to create a collective memory. The same works in the workplace. You know, in work you have that go-to person. You don't have several go-to people, because then you would have information overload. And also from efficiency point of view, it's much easier to construct a memory when there's two people rather than 5 or 6. The final thing I'm going to say on this book was something which was very interesting to me, which is smoking. So he does talk about the suicide epidemic, but I'm not going to talk about that here because it might be triggering to some people. But well, smoking might also be triggering, but it's less of a hazard. It's more of a long-term hazard. So the whole issue for Gladwell and a lot of sociologists is trying to understand why, notwithstanding all the messaging and the statistics we have around smoking, why people still do it. And what they actually found was that smokers don't overestimate the risk of smoking. Just like, people who drink don't underestimate the risks of drinking. But actually what they found was that it was like jaywalking, an imitation of what people perceive to be rebellious or cool. And this is because of the culture of smoking worldwide and our connective consciousness, which makes the language of smoking kind of irresistible. And it has been shown, for example, that in movies, smoking has been shown in a positive light. The kind of edgier characters smoke. It's never seen in a negative light. Now, I mean, they're trying to, but traditionally it was seen as a positive thing. And in that regard, when you're an adolescent, and that's the time where your social inclusion needs are at the highest, it's no wonder that teenagers start to smoke, because it's seen as this rebellious, edgy, cool thing. And same with drinking. Therefore, it feeds into that want to feel part of something. And that is probably one of the reasons why teenagers smoke. Not everybody obviously will stay smoking, and this comes down to addiction habits, different. Your genes might dictate that you have a more addictive personality, because as we know, even though nicotine is highly addictive, it's not addictive in everybody. Like, not everybody smokes and becomes an addictive smoker after having one cigarette. The interesting thing that I found from this book is that when psychiatric problems increase, the correlation with smoking grows stronger. And the other thing that they found was that 80% of alcoholics smoke and 90% of schizophrenics smoke. So basically what happens is, as smoking rates decline, as people drop off or give up, this habit becomes more concentrated in certain groups of society. So what that means is that there is a relationship, like adolescence aside, as people grow up, between emotional problems and smoking. And they look at things like low self-esteem and unhappy home life. These are the kinds of things that contribute to depression. And it is theorized that the reason some people smoke is to counteract depression, because some of the chemicals released because of smoking, like serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine, are actually able to counteract depression. A lot of the time when people give up cigarettes, they become depressed because they're not getting these chemicals. And I found that very, very interesting as to another reason why people stay addicted to cigarettes. So yeah, that is my recap of The Tipping Point. I certainly learned a lot from it. I hope you learned a few things from this video that you can share with your friends or whatnot. I think Malcolm Gladwell is an absolute legend, and I feel the more of his stuff I read, the better a human I become. I hope you enjoy this video, and I'll see you in the next one.